Hi everyone, the point of this video is to talk a little bit about what Gothic literature is, apply that to the American Gothic, and then explain how Edgar Huntley relates to that genre of literature, particularly the American Gothic, and how it's an example of American Gothic type of writing. A lot of people have referred to, I guess, Edgar Allan Poe as the father of the American Gothic, and Charles Brockden Brown, who predates Poe, could be considered the grandfather of the American Gothic. I think most of his writing is able to be classified as American Gothic. Some facets of just Gothic literature in general include all of the following. It's a type of romanticism, so if romantic literature is an umbrella, we have these things underneath it to kind of subdivide that lit. Gothic lit is a form of romanticism. Romantic period is somewhere between 1785 and 1832, and that fits our novel in pretty well because it was published in 1799. British literature has, like in the British Lit textbook from Norton, their entire section of this time period is called Romanticism. So there are some textbooks that kind of work to define the content in different ways. We see that differently when we're reading an American Lit textbook, but we're still kind of in the same period, so it makes sense that there's some overlap there. Sometimes our writers, like Charles Brockden Brown, for example, are called the Dark Romantics, and so again, we're talking about Gothic lit, we're talking about Romanticism, and so there's sort of like this blend there, and I think that's where the Dark Romanticism comes from. Some key descriptors of Gothic lit include words like wonder, terror, or morbid, or morbidity. There's this concept of sort of like being in awe and being afraid, and those two things either being causes and effects of each other, or just being overlaps or connections. I think today, in 2021, what frightens us now is probably different than what frightened people in the, turn of the century here in the time that we're talking about. I think because we just have so much more exposure to terror and morbidity and wonder in our fiction, and probably in other ways in our real lives. We can see it more than people could before. We have TVs, we have media, news, things like that. So if you're reading this stuff and you're like, I'm not really scared, am I supposed to be afraid? That's the goal, but it's a different kind of fear, and you shouldn't necessarily compare it to contemporary wonder, terror, maybe contemporary morbidity, maybe not. Gothic literature requires you to suspend your disbelief, so in order for you to really get into the lit, you have to let go of the things that you know could never happen. It's the way that you let go when you're watching a movie that has fantastical elements, when you're watching a movie that has elves, dwarves, magic, space, things that happen in space that we can't quite do just yet. Star Wars, for example, you have to suspend your disbelief to enjoy something like that. And that's also true for Gothic literature because it does have some supernatural elements. So for a text to be truly Gothic, its goal is to evoke an emotional response caused by the fear of the unknown. So it's not just of being afraid, it's not necessarily, or these things could be connected, but it's not just necessarily like a fear of the villain, a fear of being hurt. It is this fear of what you don't know, this fear of what's out there, what's lurking in the dark, what is some individual who you don't know or you don't understand. There is this big question mark that causes this emotional response. And again, that you could connect that back to these ideas of wonder and terror, a blend of those two things, or one or the other. Some elements of Gothic fiction that you'll notice in a lot of writing include someone like an innocent young woman, usually a virgin, an older woman who's foolish, or at least appears foolish. There's a hero, there's a villain. It's usually a male, usually some kind of predatory male. There are sort of like the outlaws, bandits, ruffians, that type of group of individuals. We usually will see these as a like secondary characters. Sometimes there's clergy, especially if we're talking about like American Gothic literature that is questioning like Puritan ideals, maybe some Hawthorne, something like that. Some other elements of Gothic fiction include a setting with its own secrets. So in Gothic lit, especially British Gothic lit, usually this is castles, and it's pulling from sort of like this medieval aesthetic, brings in some of the elements of like collective consciousness of reminding yourself of what it was like to live in medieval times. So there's a lot of that kind of imagery when we're talking about especially British Gothic lit. But as long as the setting has its own secrets, it doesn't necessarily have to be a castle. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Nighttime wilderness journeys fits perfectly with what we're reading. Supernatural powers, miraculous survivals, and a setting and psychology connection. So somehow what that means is like what you see happening in the setting could also be interpreted to be the mindset of the character, of the individual, of the author even, if you wanted to dig into that level of psychoanalysis. But all of this stuff kind of like is what we would say defines Gothic literature. And we can talk about, there's, of course, Poe is an example. There's a novel called The Castle of Otranto. I think I'm saying that right, maybe not. Definitely one of the first Gothic lits. A lot of Victorian era writing, and the Victorian era kind of postdates Romanticism, so we start to get into some more like intellectual reasoning in writing, but kind of like Coleridge, Christabel, late Romantic period, early Victorian period, we still see Gothic literature coming out, and then historically speaking, Victorians were definitely fascinated with this. Now, what about the American side of things? So we can apply the definition of Gothic literature to American texts, and now we get something even, one level further. If Romanticism is our umbrella, and then we have Gothic literature as a subset of that. A subset of Gothic literature is the American Gothic. And this is, what do we see with American Gothic writing? We see madness and irrational thinking. Settings are often caves, which I think is really applicable to what we're talking about in this unit. The fear of the unknown in Gothic literature, we mentioned before, like being afraid of what's out there because you can't see it, because you don't understand it, is applied here to sort of the concept of unexplored territory. So, if you think of this historically and spatially, we have our settlers who comes over and explores a certain amount of territory, and then can only go so far. They send people out, but there's so much space in America that has not been explored by our cohort of people who have newly discovered for themselves America. And so there is this fear of the unknown or unexplored territory, like what's out there in the woods that's not been settled. We get this sort of like civilization versus wilderness dichotomy that our writers are trying to consider or deal with or even bring to light. American Gothic deals with abjection, and that means that which inherently disturbs conventional identity and cultural concepts. So something is in the text that's going to disturb, and you could maybe think of this as like question or upturn, flip over conventional identity, what it means to be American, and some cultural concepts of America in terms of what we're speaking on. So, for example, a lot of American Gothic lit tackles the concept of Puritan ideas and their long-lasting effects. And so, if the abject is going to uproot that or turn it over, it's going to kind of turn something that seems idealistic and perfect into something that's horrible, terrible. Horror and terror are my words here. But it's going to flip that upside down and kind of question, okay, are these ideals actually as wonderful as we think that they are? And so that's this concept of abjection, at least applying it to the American Gothic. Another offshoot is Southern Gothic. So when we talk about Southern Gothic, usually we're talking about American Gothic, but in the South. William Faulkner is a big example here. If you want to read William Faulkner, take English 232. I think that he's in the textbook. A lot of his novels, he's got some short stories, he's got some novels, maybe you've read some, but that would be a great example of a Southern Gothic offshoot of American Gothic. So how can we apply all of this to Edgar Huntley, which is our novel for this unit? We can see all of these elements of American Gothic happening in the text. So we've got this innocent young woman. We could define this in a number of ways, or we consider, sort of the confusion of this novel. It's like there's a parallel between many of our characters. So is Mary our innocent young woman? Well, we learn that she's not so innocent, so maybe not. Maybe it's Clarice. We have an older, foolish woman, Mrs. Lorimer, possibly. Old Deb, Queen Mab, same person, but, maybe there's that concept there. How about our hero? This kind of brings into question who our protagonist is. Is Edgar our hero? Is Clitheroe our hero? Hard to say. I would say most people would jump and say Edgar is the protagonist. Does that make him a hero? And more questions that we could ask about this. We see a villain, usually male, usually predatory. So is Clitheroe our villain? Is Edgar our villain? Is the text writing in a way that would present the native people as villains? And probably they are being used to kind of function as our outlaws or bandits. Although I believe that we do have maybe another example of that. We definitely have settings with their own secrets, and in, just standard Gothic, that's usually castles, but in American Gothic, it's caves, and we definitely get caves in this novel. The wilderness has its secrets. The caves have their secrets. Even Clitheroe's property has secrets. That's not necessarily a setting, but I think that it's definitely worth considering the concept of secrets and property. Nighttime wilderness journeys does not need an example because there's too many of these in the text to even consider. I think 70% of this novel is nighttime wilderness journeys. There are supernatural powers and miraculous survivals. I mean, Edgar survives a lot of things that are probably impossible. He survives panthers twice. He survives bands of native people who are, according to Edgar, actively trying to kill him. He survives sleepwalking in very dangerous places. So I'm not necessarily saying Edgar has supernatural powers, but it is a bit supernatural that he is getting these survivals, like that he's surviving these things. And then there's definitely a connection between setting and psychology here in Edgar Huntley, because what you will notice, you maybe have already noticed this as you're reading, but there is more confusion, there's more uncertainty, and there is more just sort of like psychological disruption in the wilderness. And what I mean is, not only is it almost difficult to understand what's going on when Edgar is in the wilderness, his mindset is not fully rational when he's in the wilderness. So there's this connection between setting and psychology, and I mean the psychology of our character. And that's also true for when Edgar is in more civilized places. So things seem a little bit more rational and a little bit more logical when Edgar is in a home, in the city, just, as he goes to the outskirts of the city and starts getting close to the borders of the wilderness, we can see sort of this shift in his mindset, in his perspective, and so there is a connection there as well. And so these function as great examples to kind of reinforce this novel as an example of the American Gothic. So if you guys have any questions about this, send me an email and let me know.